They told you this is how life works. They handed you rules before you learned how to question. They called their fears truth and their limits reality, and you believed them because everyone did. But what if the problem isn't that you failed? What if the problem is that everything you were taught was wrong? Not wrong in a loud, dramatic way, wrong in a quiet way, wrong in the way that slowly convinces you to shrink your dreams, doubt your instincts, and accept a life that never felt like yours. You were taught that struggle means weakness, that pain means you're losing, that if it hasn't worked by now, it never will. But what if struggle is proof you're growing? What if pain is the cost of becoming honest? What if being lost is the first sign that you've stopped lying to yourself? Tonight isn't about rebellion. It's about awakening, because the most dangerous lie you can believe is that the world as you see it is the world as it truly is. And once you realize that, everything changes. Everything you know is wrong, not because you were foolish, not because you weren't paying attention, but because most of what you were taught was never designed to help you become yourself. It was designed to help you fit in, to stay manageable, predictable, quiet, useful in ways that benefited systems older than you, louder than you, and uninterested in who you actually are from the moment you could understand words. Someone was explaining the world to you, not asking you what you saw, not asking you what you felt, but telling you how things are, how people are supposed to behave, what success looks like, what failure means, what love should cost, what fear should stop, and what dreams are realistic enough to keep. You learned early that approval feels like safety, and silence feels like survival. So you listened, you nodded, you memorized rules that were never tested against your own instincts, and slowly you replaced curiosity with obedience, not because you wanted to, but because belonging felt more important than truth. You were told that life is a straight line, that effort always equals reward, that patience always pays off, that good people are recognized, that pain has a clear purpose, and that if something hurts for too long, it must mean you're doing something wrong. But life didn't behave the way it was explained to you. You watched honest people struggle while dishonest people advanced. You watched kind hearts break quietly while louder ones were celebrated. You watched effort disappear into nothing and shortcuts turn into success stories. And somewhere along the way, a quiet confusion settled in. At first, you blamed yourself. You thought maybe you misunderstood the instructions. Maybe you weren't disciplined enough. Maybe you lacked talent, faith, confidence, or luck. Maybe you were broken in a way everyone else figured out how to hide. No one told you that the instructions themselves were flawed. No one told you that the world often rewards performance over integrity, certainty over growth, confidence over competence, and obedience over truth. No one told you that many rules exist to protect comfort, not wisdom. So you adjusted yourself instead of questioning the structure. You learned to doubt your feelings, to silence your questions, to explain away your discomfort, to tell yourself that this is just how things are, that resistance is immature, that acceptance is maturity. But there's a difference between acceptance and surrender. And most people are taught the second one and told it's the first. You were taught that fear is something to avoid, something shameful, something that means you're weak. So you hid it, ignored it, or fought it, never realizing that fear is often the first signal that something matters. You were taught that confidence means certainty, so you pretended to know things you didn't. You avoided admitting confusion. You learned to speak in conclusions instead of questions. You were taught that success is a destination, a title, a number, a moment others can recognize. So you chased outcomes instead of understanding, applause instead of alignment, milestones instead of meaning. And when you didn't feel fulfilled after reaching the things you were told to want, you assumed gratitude was missing instead of truth. No one told you that emptiness after achievement is not ingratitude, it's information. You were taught that pain must be justified, that if something hurts, it must be earning you something later. So you stayed in places that drained you, with people who diminished you, inside roles that required you to disappear a little every day. You told yourself it was character building, that struggle is noble, that endurance equals worth. But endurance without purpose is not strength. It's slow erosion. You were taught that being lost means you failed to plan, that confusion means you lack direction, that doubt means weakness. But being lost is often the first honest moment after years of pretending to know where you were going. Confusion is what happens when old answers stop working. Doubt is what appears when borrowed beliefs collapse under the weight of real experience. You were taught to look outward for permission, for validation, for authority, for answers, grades, titles, followers, opinions, applause, metrics. You were rarely taught how to sit quietly and ask yourself what feels true when no one is watching. So when life stopped making sense, you panicked because the map you were given didn't include uncertainty, grief, reinvention, or the possibility that you might need to start over without clear instructions. No one warned you that unlearning would hurt more than learning, because learning adds, unlearning takes away. It removes certainty, identity, pride, and the comfort of thinking you already know. It forces you to admit that some of the things you defended were never yours to begin with, that some of the values you protected were inherited without examination, that some of the goals you sacrificed for were selected for you by people who never had to live with the consequences. Everything you know is wrong does not mean nothing is real. It means much of what you accepted as truth was incomplete, distorted, or shaped by fear. Fear of being different, fear of being alone, fear of being uncertain, fear of being wrong. So systems were built to reward conformity, families passed down survival rules disguised as wisdom, cultures preserved outdated beliefs because questioning them felt dangerous, and you inherited all of it before you had language for yourself. At some point, though, something cracks. It might be disappointment, it might be burnout, it might be heartbreak, it might be a quiet moment where you realize you've been living someone else's idea of a meaningful life. That crack is not a failure, it's awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable because once you see that everything you know might be wrong, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often people speak in absolutes to hide in security, how often confidence is used to silence nuance, how often that's just how it is really means that's how it's always been, and I'm afraid to question it. You notice how rarely people change their minds publicly, how dangerous curiosity feels in environments built on certainty, how much energy goes into maintaining appearances instead of understanding, and you begin to feel alone, not because you are, but because you're no longer participating in the same illusions. You begin to realize that many people don't want truth, they want stability, they want reassurance, they want stories that make their choices feel justified. And questioning those stories feels like a threat, not an invitation. So when you start asking different questions, when you stop nodding automatically, when you pause before accepting familiar explanations, some people pull away, not because you're wrong, but because you're unpredictable now. And unpredictability scares systems that depend on repetition. This is the part no one prepares you for. Outgrowing beliefs can feel like betrayal. Changing your mind can feel like losing your identity. Letting go of old goals can feel like admitting wasted time. But growth is not a straight upgrade. It's a shedding, a quiet, sometimes lonely process of releasing what no longer fits. You don't become smarter all at once. You become more honest. And honesty doesn't always look impressive. Sometimes it looks like saying, I don't know. Sometimes it looks like stepping back instead of pushing forward. Sometimes it looks like disappointing people who benefited from your compliance. You were taught that clarity comes before action, but often clarity comes after you stop pretending, after you admit confusion, after you allow yourself to sit in uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. Everything you know is wrong is not an ending. It's a reset, a chance to rebuild understanding from experience instead of inheritance, from observation instead of assumption, from curiosity instead of fear. It doesn't mean rejecting everything. It means examining everything, asking where an idea came from, who it benefits, what it costs, whether it still makes sense in your body, not just in your head. It means realizing that wisdom is not about having answers. It's about holding better questions, and better questions don't give you immediate comfort. They give you direction. Slowly, quietly, you begin to trust yourself again, not the loud, defensive version of confidence, but a calmer one. The kind that doesn't need to prove, the kind that listens, the kind that allows complexity. You stop rushing to label experiences as good or bad. You start noticing what they reveal. You stop trying to win every argument. You start trying to understand what's actually being protected. You stop assuming disagreement is hostility. You start recognizing fear underneath certainty. And somewhere in that shift, life feels different, not easier, but more real, more grounded, less performative. You realize that many of the things you were chasing were substitutes for connection, for meaning, for permission to be yourself. And once you stop chasing substitutes, you begin to feel something unfamiliar, a quiet alignment, not excitement, not certainty, but steadiness, the kind that doesn't depend on approval, the kind that doesn't collapse under doubt, the kind that allows you to move forward without needing to know exactly where you'll end up. Everything you know is wrong is not an accusation. It's an invitation to see clearly, to live deliberately, to choose consciously instead of automatically, to stop confusing familiarity with truth and comfort with correctness, to recognize that the world you inherited is not the world you have to accept, and that the most important things you will ever understand will not be handed to you. They will be discovered slowly, honestly, through experience, through reflection, through the courage to admit that certainty was never the goal. Awareness was. Discomfort is not failure, but you were taught to treat it like one, to see unease as a warning sign that something has gone wrong, that you've stepped off the correct path, that you should turn back immediately and return to whatever feels familiar, stable, and approved. From a young age, comfort was framed as success and discomfort as danger. So you learned to chase ease instead of understanding, relief instead of truth, certainty instead of growth. When something felt hard, awkward, heavy, or confusing, the instinct was to escape it, to distract yourself, to numb it, to label it as a mistake rather than a message. But discomfort is often the first honest response your awareness has when an old belief no longer fits. It's the body reacting before the mind has words. It's the signal that something inside you is waking up faster than the story you've been telling yourself. Most people never learn this. They learn to override discomfort with explanations. They tell themselves they're overthinking. They minimize what they feel. They rationalize what doesn't sit right. They stay busy enough to avoid listening, because listening would require change, and change would require letting go. So discomfort becomes something to manage instead of something to understand. But awareness doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't knock politely. It disrupts. It interrupts. It unsettles. When you begin to see cracks in the narratives you relied on, your first reaction isn't clarity, it's unease, because clarity would require resolution, and awareness often arrives long before resolution does. You start noticing contradictions. Things that once made sense now feel hollow. Advice that once sounded wise now feels shallow. Goals you chased with certainty now feel strangely empty. And instead of celebrating this awareness, you judge yourself for feeling unsettled. You ask what's wrong with you, why you can't just be satisfied, why you're questioning things that everyone else seems comfortable accepting. But comfort is often a sign of familiarity, not truth. People can be deeply comfortable inside illusions. They can feel safe inside routines that slowly erase them. They can feel confident inside beliefs they never chose. Discomfort is what happens when awareness outpaces habit, when perception evolves faster than identity, when the version of you that's emerging no longer fits the structures built for who you used to be. That friction is not weakness, it's transition. But transition doesn't look heroic. It looks uncertain. It looks quiet. It looks like second guessing. It looks like standing still while everyone else seems to be moving forward. You were taught that forward motion is always progress. but sometimes stillness is the most honest movement you can make, because awareness needs space. It needs time to rearrange meaning, to dissolve assumptions, to sit with questions that don't yet have answers. Discomfort forces you into that space. It removes the distractions. It strips away easy explanations. It asks you to stay present without certainty. That's why it feels unbearable at times, because you can't rush it. You can't dominate it. You can't solve it with the same thinking that created it. Most people confuse discomfort with danger, but danger demands immediate action. Discomfort demands attention. It asks you to look closer, to slow down, to notice what you've been ignoring, what you've been tolerating, what you've been calling normal just to survive. Awareness doesn't announce itself with confidence. It arrives as doubt, as hesitation, as an uncomfortable sense that something isn't aligned, and alignment is not about feeling good all the time. It's about feeling honest. Honesty doesn't always feel safe. Sometimes it destabilizes your entire sense of self, because when you realize that a belief you've lived by no longer feels true, you're forced to confront how much of your life was organized around it, your choices, your sacrifices, your identity. That realization hurts, not because awareness is cruel, but because attachment is deep. You weren't just attached to beliefs, you were attached to the certainty they provided, to the sense of direction they gave you, to the approval they earned you. Letting go of that certainty feels like stepping into open space without a map. And your nervous system doesn't like that. It wants structure, it wants predictability, it wants reassurance. So it sends signals of discomfort, restlessness, anxiety, doubt. But those signals are not telling you to retreat. They're telling you to pay attention and to listen more carefully, to stop forcing yourself into explanations that no longer resonate. Awareness doesn't destroy your life. It reveals what was already misaligned. Discomfort is the cost of that revelation. You were taught that growth feels empowering, that transformation feels uplifting, that progress feels motivating, but real growth often feels destabilizing before it feels empowering. It shakes your confidence. It questions your assumptions. It removes the illusion of control, because control was often built on limited understanding, and awareness expands the field. Suddenly you see complexity, you see nuance, you see how little you actually know, and that realization is humbling. Humility is uncomfortable because it dismantles ego, and ego is never your enemy, it was your armor. You used it to survive expectations, to protect yourself from judgment, to justify your decisions. Awareness asks you to loosen that armor, to feel more, to admit uncertainty, to stand in questions without rushing toward answers. This is why discomfort is misunderstood. It doesn't feel productive. It doesn't produce immediate results. It doesn't earn applause. It looks like hesitation in a world that worships decisiveness. But decisiveness without awareness is just momentum, and momentum can carry you far in the wrong direction. Discomfort slows you down enough to notice where you're going. It interrupts patterns. It exposes habits. It reveals motivations you didn't know were driving you. Why you say yes when you mean no. Why you stay when you want to leave. Why you chase things that don't fulfill you. Why you fear disappointing others more than disappointing yourself. Awareness makes these patterns visible. Discomfort makes them impossible to ignore, and once you see them, you can't pretend you didn't. That's when the real tension begins, because awareness doesn't force change. It invites it. An invitation leaves room for choice. You can ignore it, suppress it, distract yourself from it. Many people do, not because they're weak, but because awareness demands courage. It demands responsibility. Once you see clearly, you can't blame ignorance. You can't claim innocence. You can't say you didn't know. Discomfort is the threshold. On one side is familiarity, on the other is authenticity. Standing at that threshold feels unbearable because both sides carry loss. If you stay, you lose yourself. If you move forward, you lose certainty. And certainty is addictive. It feels like safety, even when it's false. So your body resists, your mind resists, your habits resist, and that resistance is felt as discomfort. But resistance is not proof you're wrong. It's proof that something significant is shifting. Awareness doesn't replace your old beliefs all at once. It dismantles them piece by piece, leaving gaps, leaving questions, leaving unfinished thoughts. And unfinished thoughts are uncomfortable. They don't allow closure. They don't allow simple narratives. They don't allow clean identities. You're no longer who you were, but you're not yet who you're becoming. And that in-between space is rarely celebrated, but it's where honesty lives. It's where you stop performing certainty and start developing wisdom. Wisdom doesn't rush. It listens. It tolerates ambiguity. It allows discomfort to exist without trying to eliminate it, because discomfort is information. It tells you where to look, what to question, what to reevaluate. It's not an alarm telling you to escape. It's a signal inviting you to stay present, to investigate, to feel more deeply instead of numbing. You were taught to be efficient with your emotions, to manage them, to control them, but awareness asks you to experience them fully without immediate judgment, without premature conclusions. Discomfort expands your capacity. It teaches you how to hold complexity, how to sit with uncertainty, how to remain grounded without needing guarantees. And this capacity changes how you move through the world. You stop reacting automatically. You pause, you observe, you respond with intention instead of impulse. That pause is uncomfortable at first because it disrupts habit, but it's where choice is born. Without discomfort, awareness has no friction. Without friction, nothing changes. You don't grow by staying comfortable. You grow by staying present when comfort disappears. And presence is not passive, it's active attention. It's the courage to feel what you feel, to question what you believe, to admit what no longer works. Discomfort is not something to overcome, it's something to understand. It's awareness asking, you to stop running, to stop numbing, to stop performing, and start listening, not to the noise outside, but to the quiet signals inside, the ones that tell you something is shifting, something is dissolving, something is asking to be re-examined. And the more you resist that signal, the louder it becomes, because awareness doesn't disappear when ignored. It accumulates, it builds pressure until the discomfort you avoided turns into burnout or resentment or emptiness or a sense that you're living a life that looks fine but feels hollow. That hollow feeling is not ingratitude. It's awareness starved of expression. Discomfort is the beginning of that expression. It's the language awareness uses before words catch up. And once you learn to listen to it, not as an enemy, but as a guide, your relationship with yourself changes. You stop measuring progress by comfort. You start measuring it by honesty. You stop fearing confusion. You start respecting it, because confusion means old answers are dissolving and new understanding is forming. Even if you can't see it yet, discomfort doesn't mean you're lost. It means you're no longer pretending to know. And that is not failure. That is awareness breaking through. Unlearning is the real beginning of becoming yourself. But almost no one tells you how disorienting that process is, because unlearning doesn't add knowledge, it removes certainty, and certainty is what most identities are built on. From early on, you were rewarded for knowing, for answering correctly, for appearing sure, for choosing sides, for defending positions, and over time you learned that being right felt safer than being honest. So you collected beliefs the way others collect tools, not always because you tested them, but because they helped you navigate expectations, earn approval, avoid conflict, and feel anchored in a world that demands clarity, even when none exists. Those beliefs became habits of thought. They shaped how you interpreted events, how you judged others, how you explained yourself, and eventually how you defined who you are. Unlearning threatens all of that. Because when you let go of a belief, you don't just lose an idea, you lose a reference point, a way of understanding your past, a justification for your choices, a story that made your sacrifices feel meaningful. That's why unlearning feels like loss before it feels like freedom. You're not just releasing information, you're releasing identity, and identity doesn't dissolve quietly. It resists, it clings, it negotiates. It tries to reframe instead of release. Most people think growth means becoming more more confident, more successful, more knowledgeable. But growth often begins by becoming less certain, less defensive, less attached to explanations that no longer fit. Unlearning is subtractive. It strips away borrowed narratives, inherited fears, assumptions you never consciously chose. And what's left can feel disturbingly empty at first, because that space was once filled with answers, rules, certainties, directions. Without them, you feel exposed, not because you are unsafe, but because you are no longer hiding behind structure. Structure once protected you from ambiguity, from the discomfort of not knowing, from the responsibility of choosing for yourself. Unlearning removes that protection, and in doing so, it hands you something heavier, agency. Agency is not empowering at first. It's intimidating, because once you accept that many of your beliefs were learned, not discovered, you're forced to ask which ones still belong to you. And that question doesn't come with instructions. There's no checklist for authenticity, no guarantee that what you choose will be praised, no certainty that you'll be understood. Becoming yourself means risking misalignment with people who preferred the version of you that was easier to predict, the version that followed scripts, the version that didn't question too deeply, the version that made sense within existing systems. Unlearning that version can feel like betrayal, not because you're disloyal, but because others built expectations around your consistency. And unlearning disrupts consistency. It introduces pause, hesitation, change. You stop responding automatically. You start questioning reflexes. You notice how often your reactions were rehearsed, how often your opinions were inherited, how often your values were shaped by fear of exclusion rather than inner conviction. That noticing changes everything, because once you see a pattern, you can't pretend it's not there. Unlearning makes you aware of how often you are performing certainty instead of living truth. Performance is rewarded. Truth is inconvenient. Performance fits into timelines. Truth unfolds at its own pace. Unlearning slows you down, not because you're regressing, but because you were paying attention. Attention reveals contradictions between what you say you value and how you actually live, between what you pursue and what fulfills you, between who you present as and who you feel like when no one is watching. Those contradictions are uncomfortable. They don't mean you're fake. They mean you're human. And unlearning invites you to reconcile them, not by judging yourself, but by becoming more honest. Honesty is not harsh. It's precise. It requires you to admit where you've been operating on autopilot, where you've been avoiding responsibility, where you've been choosing comfort over alignment. Unlearning doesn't ask you to reject your past. It asks you to understand it, to see why certain beliefs made sense at the time, why they helped you survive, why they once felt necessary. That compassion matters, because without it, unlearning turns into self-punishment, and self-punishment only replaces one rigid identity with an ought. True unlearning is gentle but firm. It doesn't rush. It doesn't force. It allows understanding to mature, and maturity is quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself. As you unlearn, you start to notice subtle shifts. Your reactions soften, your listening deepens, your need to be right diminishes. You become more curious about perspectives that once threatened you, not because you're uncertain, but because you're secure enough to explore without defending. This is where becoming yourself actually begins, not when you declare who you are, but when you stop clinging to who you thought you had to be. The self that emerges from unlearning is not louder, it's steadier, it doesn't rush to explain, it doesn't need constant validation. It's comfortable saying, I don't know, because it trusts that understanding will come through experience, not ideology. Unlearning teaches you that identity is not a fixed structure. It's a living process, something you participate in, something that evolves. As your awareness deepens, this realization changes how you approach life. You stop making permanent decisions based on temporary understanding. You allow yourself room to revise, to adapt, to grow. You no longer see changing your mind as failure. You see it as responsiveness to new information. to lived experience, to inner signals you once ignored. Becoming yourself is not about finding a final version. It's about staying in conversation with who you are becoming. And that conversation requires humility, because humility, thank you, allows you to release the need to have arrived. Most people cling to identity because it gives them stability, but stability without authenticity becomes confinement. Unlearning opens the door, even if stepping through feels uncertain. You begin to trust that you don't need rigid definitions to move forward. You need presence, attention, willingness. You stop asking, who am I supposed to be, and start asking what feels true right now. That question is quieter, but more powerful, because it's grounded in lived reality, not expectation. Unlearning teaches you to hold beliefs lightly, to let them evolve, to update them when they no longer serve truth. This flexibility is not weakness, it's resilience. Rigid structures break under pressure, living systems adapt, and you are a living system, not a finished product. The more you unlearn, the more space you create for intuition, for nuance, for compassion, for depth. You become less interested in proving, more interested in understanding, less focused on control, more open to relationship with yourself, with others, with uncertainty. And in that openness, something stabilizes, not certainty, but trust. Trust that you can navigate without fixed answers. Trust that you can adjust when needed. Trust that becoming yourself is not a destination, but an ongoing act of honesty. And that honesty does not demand perfection. It demands presence. Unlearning doesn't make life simpler. It makes it truer. And truth doesn't rush. It unfolds. As you do,